Well, all right. Well, listen, if you were not here last week, we were doing a lesson on this wonderful book by Marcus Borg called Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. It's a great book. It's in our library here at Boston Avenue, so if you'd like to pick it up, you can. And we're going to do, I did all of one chapter last week and part of a second. And we'll do, I think we'll only have time for this second chapter today, which is on, when we started, we talked about how Jesus taught. And we used, we were talking about parables. We were talking about his aphorisms. Remember that word, aphorisms, which is a short, little bitty parable, really is what it is, a small parable. In teaching, Jesus being a wisdom teacher, Borg wants to go into what it means to be, what kind of wisdom he's imparting. What is Jesus coming to do that's different from what's in there, the normal wisdom, say, that's out there. And he calls that conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom. He is coming, in Borg's mind, to really thwart, to turn upside down the conventional wisdom of the day that's out there. Well, let's talk a little bit about conventional wisdom, what it is, and all this. You'll know what it is when I get into it. So hang on, it's not a big term. Conventional wisdom is the dominant consciousness of any culture, no matter what, all the way back to ancient times. It is a culture's taken for granted understandings about the way things are, their worldview, okay, and about the way to live your life. It is consciousness that is shaped by culture. It helps us understand the first century Jewish social world, and it also helps us understand our own. So, conventional wisdom provides guidance about how to live. Now, let's give an example, okay? One example we could talk about, let's say our own conventional wisdom before, really, in the 40s, 50s, 30s, 40s, 50s, right in there, there was a time when most doctors would say that smoking is not that harmful to your health. That was conventional wisdom at that time, right? I mean, my mom smoked, my dad smoked. It just was not. It was cool. It made you look more grown up. That part hasn't gone away. Kids still think that. But it certainly is bad for your health. But that changed. Another conventional wisdom is that an incumbent candidate or an incumbent person who's in office nearly always wins more votes than a new candidate. Okay, that would be a conventional wisdom. It's out there, whether it's true or not. That's the thing. But that tends to get out there. Another one, this is from history, conventional wisdom prior to Christopher Columbus held that the world was flat. Okay, when in actuality, of course, many scholars, even at that time, knew that the Earth was round. Just look at the moon, kind of thing, and you'll see it's round. So that kind of conventional wisdom that pervades or goes through a culture, not necessarily true, okay? Often not true, but it's often seen as an obstacle to introducing or understanding new theories, explanations, and so it's seen as an obstacle that needs to be overcome. I picked that up from another source, not from Borg, and it fits here. It fits very well. Conventional wisdom embodies the central values of a culture, of what is worthwhile, how it images the good life. In first century Judaism, this kind of guidance was provided by the Torah. The Torah provided all that. And the folk wisdom of the culture as well, partly found in the book of Proverbs. If you look at Proverbs, you'll see a lot of good wisdom in that book. That's what it's imparting. You learned not by study so much as just by growing up in the culture. It's true. It's true, we do. So some of the ones, some conventional wisdom is about reward and punishment, too. You reap what you sow. You get what you deserve. You follow this way and all will go well. The righteous will prosper. Those kind of things are there as well. Conventional wisdom has both social and psychological consequences. I can talk a long time about this. I'm going to keep moving. But it can be, psychologically, whether in religious or secular form, conventional wisdom creates a world in which we live. So you could say a false world. You could, because if you're dealing with false impressions, the world is flat. You're living in that world. You're going to act like that. You're going to be afraid of ever getting in a boat. You're going to be living a world that is not really set in reality, is what they're saying. And so he calls it a domestication of reality, a net thrown over reality. So now I want to read just a part out of his book that I think explains well. There is an image of God that goes with a world of conventional wisdom. When conventional wisdom appears in religious form, God is imaged primarily as a lawgiver or a judge. God may be spoken of in other ways as well, but the bottom line is that God is seen as both the source and the enforcer, and therefore the legitimator of the religious form of conventional wisdom. God becomes the one whom we must satisfy, the one whose requirements must be met. And when this happens in the Christian tradition, it leads to an image of the Christian life as a life of requirements. Indeed, this happens so frequently that it is the most common form of Christianity. Think about it. It is important to realize this in part so that we do not make the mistake of equating conventional wisdom with Judaism and alternative wisdom. That's what Jesus brings in, alternative wisdom, with Christianity. That we don't do that. That's not a good combination. It is very common for Christians to identify Judaism with a religion of law and an image of God as wrathful and judgmental, in contrast to Christianity, which is seen as a religion of grace with an image of God as forgiving and loving. We know that, do we not? I grew up with that kind of image. Well, it seems the Old Testament, it's about, the God who's going to smite everybody, He's out smiting and smoting and all this, this people, that people, and then move on. And yet, when I got to seminary, that's where the professor I had, he turned that one around in a hurry. He talked about all the grace that was in the Old Testament. Look at the covenant that got remade again and again and again, with Abraham and Jacob and the covenant with Noah. Over and over again, that kind of God of grace that says, I forgive you. That's very much in the Old Testament. But conventional wisdom says otherwise. Let's see, just a little bit more here. Conventional wisdom is not to be identified with any particular tradition, with either Judaism or Christianity or any of them. It is pervasive in all traditions. To emphasize the point again, the conflict between conventional wisdom and alternative wisdom is not a conflict between Judaism and Christianity, but a conflict within both traditions. So, the consequences of conventional wisdom for us Protestants are that salvation by works changed to salvation by grace through faith. And within conventional wisdom, the emphasis changed from grace to faith. That was an important one. And think about it. Faith was what was required, and a lack of faith risked eternal punishment. That's kind of how it developed in tradition. I'm not saying this is the way it is, so don't hear it that way. But this is how it developed. So for many Protestants, this system of conventional wisdom remained. Only the content had changed from good works to faith. So instead of working for your salvation through good works, you kind of work for it through, am I faithful enough? As some would say, well, you're just not praying enough. You're just not, if so-and-so died in your life, well, you obviously, you weren't praying hard enough. It's like, what a horrible thing to say. I've heard ministers say that to people. I have heard them. And it's just an awful, it's terrible theology. That's not what it is, but it's out there. The requirement of faith divides the world. Those who have faith and those who don't have faith. See, that's what it does. It splits us up. And we get smug. That's what we get. And divisive. Now, enter. That's all done. Let's enter the alternative wisdom of Jesus. What does He bring to combat that understanding? That understanding. Jesus, of course, used paradox and reversal in His parables and stories through His wisdom teaching. Again, He was a wonderful, wonderful teacher, and He was trying to shatter the conventional wisdom of His time. So He would say a Samaritan who is a heretic and an impure person. I mean, that's what a Samaritan was in that day. Okay? A Samaritan was a heretic and an impure person. And yet, in His stories, in Jesus' stories, a Samaritan can be good and a hero. See? Yep. Turn it upside down. Reversal. A Pharisee who is supposed to be righteous and pure can be unrighteous in his stories. Riding a donkey is a symbol of kingship. I mean, it was very calculated. I mean, what Jesus did there, He took that and said, this is my kingdom. I'm riding in on a donkey. The poor are blessed. Flip it around. The first are last, and the last are first. See, the kingdom is tiny. This kingdom, it's itty bitty. It's like a grain of mustard seed, And it's like, I don't get that. This doesn't match. That's not conventional wisdom. It turns it on its ear. See, it flips it upside down. Or the kingdom is like a woman, and in that time, a woman, forgive me, and it's Mother's Day, was impure. Okay, it was impure. So putting leaven. And leaven was impure as well. See, that's most people don't catch that in that wonderful parable, because they think the kingdom of heaven is like a woman who takes leaven, puts it in the bread, and it grows and grows. And we think, oh, isn't that wonderful? The kingdom just grows and grows. No, it's taking something impure, leaven, and putting it in the loaf and allowing it to grow. So it's like, ooh, that's bad. And then having a woman come in and work on it. And it was like, ugh! That's what it was. And Jesus is flipping things upside down. Jesus spoke of conventional wisdom as the broad way, the wide gate, and directly attacked the central values of His social world: family, wealth, purity. And in that culture, the family was primary. The primary social unit, okay? Yet, Jesus spoke of leaving family, didn't He? Spoke of leaving family and even hating family. It's like, ouch. It really, He got you where it hurts sometimes. Jesus is not a comfortable prophet. He's not. It's like, oh, I love Jesus. It's just great all the time. No, it's not. It's supposed to really gnaw at you. He's flipping things upside down and it hurts. His words, call no man on earth your father, for you have one Father in heaven, may be directed against the patriarchal family, says Borg, which was a microcosm of the hierarchical system. So, to make a statement like that, call no man on earth your father. why not? I have a Father. So you just have to hang in there with them. And again, that's why parables, I've always said, and Brandon Scott will say this too, you have to sip them. You can't just swallow them and say, oh, I get it. I get parables, sure. It means this. Well, if that's the case, then go back and read it again. Because it's when you have to sip them and take them in and just say, I'm going to sit with that for a while and then come back to it again later. Jesus' image of God. Okay, we're switching to that. In many of Jesus' parables and aphorisms, he invited his listeners to see God not as the judge, not as the one who has requirements to be met, but as gracious and compassionate. Gracious and compassionate. In Matthew 6:26, it says, "Consider the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap, and yet God feeds them." Okay? God's compassionate to even the lowliest bird. Luke 12:24, "Consider the lilies of the field. They neither toil nor spin." Jesus invites us to see the source of all life as gracious and generous. Let me read one other passage here. The same note is sounded in other familiar sayings. Jesus speaks of God as one who makes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and as one who sends the rain upon the just and the unjust, without thought of reward or punishment. God knows us well. Even the hairs on our heads are numbered. God sees even a sparrow fall, and we are of greater value than many sparrows. In the story of the vineyard owner who pays all of the workers the same amount, regardless of how long or how hard they have worked. You know that story. In fact, I did a sermon not too long ago, Dr. Biggs did. No matter how long they've worked, the hearers, that's us, are invited to enter a world in which everybody receives what they need. The workers who complain are the voice of the old world, the world of conventional wisdom. And the vineyard owner's response to them is striking. Do you begrudge my generosity? The parable invites the hearers to consider that God is like this and not like the God of requirements and rewards. And those themes run through his best-known story, the prodigal son, probably. I mean, to me, that's just right up there, boy. That's my number one. I love that story. We all do. And those same themes. A father who runs toward the son who has done him wrong. I mean, really bad. Just, flung his nose at him and said, forget you. And here, this father, we say, there's God just running and embracing him. I mean, that's quite a story. Let's say a little more about prodigal son. We really see Jesus' artistry as a storyteller in this one. His invitational style, his subversion of conventional wisdom, and then bringing in his own alternative wisdom. An image of God as gracious and compassionate. He says this story of the prodigal son is really a story in 3 acts. 3 acts. Act 1, it's this prodigal, this son's life described in detail. He becomes worse than untouchable. He goes out and works where? In a swine herd, in the lowest of the low. That's Act 1. Act 2, the focus shifts to the Father. See his compassion toward his son, brushing aside his son's prepared confession. The son was going home. I'm going to tell my father, I'll do anything. I'll even work outside. I'll do whatever. The father just brushes that aside, doesn't even let him say it. And the father then clothes his son with the very best. And then there's Act 3. And the Act 3 is for you and me. Okay? It's getting to this point. This is really the point of the parable, you could say, because its focus is on the older son. And who's the older son? Us. We're the older son. We're the ones who are saying, that's not right. That's not right. The older son, he refuses to join the banquet. He's been dutiful and obedient all my life. I have read the Bible every day for the last 100 years. And this is what you do? I mean, that's what we'd think, wouldn't it? I've done all these things. I have been here every day. I got up early and I did this, and you're letting him off the hook? But, that's what we'd say. And yet, he was never treated so wondrously. The father implores this older son to join the celebration anyway. Okay, so there's God speaking to us saying, join the celebration anyway. The question left hanging, will the older son's sense of the way things ought to be keep him out of the banquet? Now, folks, that's a question we could just ponder for the rest of our time and right on through till Memorial Day, because it's a great question. The way things ought to be are, just think of a situation in your own family, okay, of a son or a daughter who has acted in a way that you did not care for. And so they ought to, what? You can finish that statement. They ought to give me a phone call. They ought to call me and apologize, by God. They ought to, bring me a present. They ought to take me out to dinner because I deserve it, for one. And you can just go on. What they ought to do. And yet we get caught. Again, take this parable. We get caught in that place often in our relationships. It doesn't have to be with family. It can always be with friends too. Well, she did, or he should have, or my brother. I've got lots of things to say about my brother, I can tell you. It's that piece that keeps us out of the celebration. It's as though that's not for us. Or at least, yes, it may be for some for a little while, but it's not for us always. And what the parable's saying, the way Borg is presenting it is, nope, we can participate in this always. This is what Jesus has done for us. And this is how God relates to us. So, it's hard though. It's hard. And that's why the story is so touching to us. This parable represents a subversion of the world of conventional wisdom. The older son's voice is the voice of conventional wisdom itself. I mean, that's it. It's he's saying what ought to be done. See, that's a good one. It's his voice that the hearers, us, that we hear, and we're invited to hear as perhaps our own, and then to reject, hopefully. So look at the image of the religious life in this story. It's a religious life, okay? Think of that, religious life. It's a life of exile. It's a life of exile in a far country and a journey of return. So think about your own life. Is that what your life was like? That's what my life was like if I have to look at it. Now, you got to put it metaphorically sometimes too. I went out and I went to college. I got married. Went out. I got divorced. I mean, it was a whole journey of being out there and always, just my own story, always trying to come home in a sense. Trying to come home to God in a way. And here, I was a minister and doing all this, so you'd think, well, boy, you just got it. Well, no, I'm human too. And so we take this journey of exile and return, they say, out into a far country. Yeah, it was the far country of the hinterlands of Oklahoma, in small little churches, or working for the Methodists out there. That was my country. And then returning home. That was the religious life. But it's not, he would say, it's not a life of duty, requirements, and rewards. That may trip up some of you out there. It may. It's tough not going through it, because religion is presented so often to us today as just that. It's a life of rewards and punishments. Just turn on the TV. You see it, over and over again. That's not what this is coming across as. So the image of God at the center of Jesus' teaching undermines this reward and punishment. Speaking of God as gracious and compassionate, as womb-like, is very different from God as a judge and lawgiver. Does Jesus' message, he asks, have any element of judgment in it? Let's see, do I want to get into this? I jumped in and I should have looked before I jumped. No, I don't. No, I don't. I'm not. That's just a whole nother lesson right there. Nope, I'm not going there. If you want to, come talk to me another way. It's not, I think we'll move forward this way. How are we doing on time? How are we doing? Are we all right? Oh my gosh, yeah, we're fine. So the next section, he talks about the way less traveled. The way, which is the way of Jesus. See the image of the heart. The heart, he says. Jesus used the heart to speak of the need for internal, here's that word again, transformation. Internal transformation. The heart. The heart represents the self at its deepest level. At its deepest level. When it is centered, when the heart is centered in the finite, it is hard and closed. But a new heart is needed by deeply centering on God. So, love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, all your mind. This is the narrow way. That's the narrow way. It is also spoken of as the way of death. Now, how does that fit? The way of death. Whoever does not, Luke speaks it, whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Yikes. And what Borg would say in here is that death is the ultimate letting go. Yeah, you could, excuse me. Yes, that's an understatement, isn't it? The ultimate letting go and the opposite of grasping, of hanging on. The path of death also is a path of new life. Now take that metaphorically, okay? Walking through something very, very difficult. It feels like a death. And I've got to move on. It could be with the death of a spouse, just something like that. And how do you live your life beyond that? I shared, in the service before, my mother died when I was in college. I was 20 years old. And my mom and I were best friends. So to move on, how do you move on? We had to figure that out. You had to figure that out. Some do, some don't. It's been... it's tough and it was difficult, but a way of letting go and embracing a new future. It's that dynamic there. It is also a life in the Spirit. A life in the Spirit. This seems the best explanation of where Jesus' wisdom comes from. Jesus knew God as the compassionate one, not a God of requirements. And that is, for him, this life in the Spirit. That's what it means. So in our time, in 2009, conventional wisdom would have really three dominant values, Borg thinks. Achievement, affluence, and appearance. Like those. So it's easy to remember. Achievement, affluence, and appearance. The way of Jesus invites us to move from second-hand religion to first-hand religion, he says. What does that mean? Well, second-hand being religious-based on believing what one has heard from others, believing the Bible, believing the doctrines, to first-hand religion, which is a relationship, okay, to that reality that we call God, or to Spirit of God. So finding that relationship, and through that, again, being transformed. Being transformed. Because, again, what's the point of it if you're not transformed in some way? I mean, that's what religion ought to be about. It ought to be, there I said it. Boy, bad use that. Shouldn't have used it that way. Somebody says, no shoulding. Stop the shouldings and the couldings and all that, and no oughts in there and no musts. It's really about a relationship, getting into that. So this transformation is central to the alternative wisdom of Jesus. That's who He was. He was about an alternative path, and also the Jewish tradition. If we looked at the book of Job, okay, the book of Job is really a good one. One of the most powerful expressions of this transformation is to be found in the book of Job. At its climax, after Job has experienced a dramatic self-disclosure of God, he says, "I had heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye beholds thee." That change, says Borg, from having heard about God with the hearing of the ear to beholding God, from second-hand belief to first-hand relationship, is what the alternative wisdom of Jesus is most centrally about. Okay? If you want to get that, if you want to look that up later, let me give you the passage 58. That's Job 42:5. Okay, Job 42:5. The gospel of Jesus, the good news of Jesus' own message, is that there is a way of being that moves beyond both secular and religious conventional wisdom. So that's a wonderful statement. Both secular and religious wisdom. The path of transformation to a life of relationship with God. No, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. The path of transformation of which Jesus spoke leads from a list of requirements and measuring up to a life of relationship. It leads from a life of anxiety to a life of peace and trust. I hope that we can all find that, in our whatever way we connect with God, whatever, I might call it this way, a spiritual practice. If you have a spiritual practice, that may be getting up and doing a devotional every morning. That could be it. It could be meditating. That's mine. Actually, I like to meditate. I like to sit still, be quiet. And that's tough for a guy like me who is such an outgoing extrovert. I mean, that's hard to do. But I've had to learn. I'm 50. I turn 51 tomorrow. Okay, and it's taken me, every month of that to get to feeling comfortable being still. And yet it's a richness. Gosh, it really is. It's a richness there that I have heard from other people who have gotten there. And but that may not be your way. Again, whatever way you connect to have a relationship, what they say is mine it well. Get in, start digging, and go for it. Get into it, and I think you'll be really opened and blessed by that. All right, let's see. I said it leads from a life of anxiety to a life of peace and trust. That's where I was getting. Peace and trust. I feel that a lot more in my life because of that spiritual practice. It leads from the bondage of self-preoccupation to the freedom of self-forgetfulness. Self-forgetfulness. It leads from life centered in culture to life centered in God. In God. So that's the end of that chapter right there. That's a big one. I'll tell you. Now, there's a lot in that. I'm sorry to just have you, I kind of had to pull you through that one because there was so much to it. But I've never seen presented as well of a presentation on what Jesus was really presenting in His ministry. It kind of broke it down in a way that said, this is why He came. This was the kind of wisdom that He brought over against what was there in that first century world. And then you come off to the other side and say, so this will preach. I mean, it really does. It preaches very well. But again, it's risking flipping things upside down. You may have heard, but I say to you, I mean, have we heard Jesus say that? You bet. You may have heard it said this way, but I say that's kind of how our sermons ought to be, really, because it's always there. Conventional wisdom isn't going anywhere. Obviously, 2,000 years later, we're still mired in it, and that's just the way cultures are. So this stuff really preaches well. Okay, questions? Any comments about anything? I've got more to share, and we've got a few more minutes. Okay? All right. You all are troopers. You really are. All right, here we go. This next part, and we won't be able to get much into this, but it's images of Jesus and images of the Christian life. Images of Jesus and images of the Christian life. Borg starts off just saying that Jesus' own understanding of Himself was not as a Son of God to die for the sins of the world. I may shock some people here with that, but I think he's right. I do. I don't think Jesus was walking around thinking of Himself in that way while He was here. Jesus was a spirit person, says Borg, a subversive sage, a social prophet, and a movement founder within the Jewish tradition. He didn't come to set up a new religion. I mean, I think a lot of scholars today would say, yep, that's right. He really didn't. He didn't come to set up Christianity like that. It's what the others of us did with it. We set that up later. Let's see, movement founder. He invited His followers into a transforming relationship with the Spirit, as we said, and into a community whose social vision was shaped by what? Compassion. Sure. So he had really what he calls a story theology. Story was very central in Jewish and Christian scriptures. That's, we know that. You understand that quite well, I'm sure. We've lost that, though, he says, with theology that tries to conceptualize things. The narrative gets lost often because we're talking about grace or sin. We're conceptualizing pieces of it when the narrative used to be very prominent. Story theology seeks to recapture the story character of Scripture. And he says this is the ancient approach. This is the ancient approach. So Borg says that there are really three macro big stories at the heart of Scripture that shape the Bible as a whole. This is fun stuff. Each images what the religious life is most centrally about. Namely, that something is wrong with our lives as we typically live them, and they speak of some solution to that problem. Number one, okay, let's cut to the chase. Number one, the Exodus story. The Exodus story is really the key story, as we know, of the history of Israel. It shaped their identity, their sense of who they were, and their sense of God. It was a story not just about the past, but about the present, too. Let's see. I'd love to be sure I get to all three of these because I want you to hear All three. Okay, I got about 15 minutes here, and we'll get moving. It's a story of bondage. It's a journey. It's a destination. The Exodus. Again, you know what Exodus means? It's the way or the road out. The road out. It's good. The people are brought into the wilderness that sets them on a journey. It lasts 40 years, and the destination is the Promised Land, or where God's presence can be found. That place. So what's the story saying? That we are in bondage. We're in bondage. That's the overarching story for all of us. Not that it happened back then and that's their story and forget it. That's our story too. What are we in bondage to? What could it be? For some, maybe drugs and others. For some, it may be our affluence. For some, it could be a lot of things. What are we in bondage to? That's the question. It could be cultural messages that come through. And the Pharaoh who holds us is inside as well as outside. In us as well as out there. Who is the Pharaoh inside of you? Inside of me? Who is the Pharaoh? How is fear and oppression used for the Pharaoh to remain in control? The solution to this one is liberation somehow. Leaving Egypt and the kingdom of Pharaoh. Taking a passage from one kind of life to another. But liberation always leads to wilderness. It's interesting. It leads to you got to be willing to go out into the wilderness and sit there for a while. It's scary. And some say, no, I don't want to do that. And so, okay. But wilderness is that place beyond culture. A place of freedom where God is encountered, but also a place of fear and anxiety, where idols are erected. So all that's happening. So the destination of the journey is life in the presence of God. That's where they're headed. Even though God is on the journey as well, both toward God and with God. All right, that's one story, the Exodus. Second story is the story of exile and the story of the return. Going in exile, coming back. What is that story saying? Of course, they're focusing on the Babylonian exile, that one, 587 to 539 BCE. But what is life in exile like? Well, it's a separation. It's a real separation from all that is familiar. It's an experience of powerlessness, too, and marginality, of oppression, of victimization. You can see, look at the psychology of how that bears on us, not just them. There is much grief, a lot of grief. If you read Psalm 137, you'll see the kind of grief that's there. Psalm 137, an aching loneliness. So if the problem, I want to finish this. If exile is living away from the place where God is present, and you think there's the Garden of Eden, and then there's living east of Eden. That wonderful book by Steinbeck. East of Eden, that's where we live. So if the problem is exile, the solution is somehow a journey of return. Somehow a journey of return. And again, this is our story. This is all of our story. So what is your exile? What has that been for you? It's a way of rethinking your life and in terms of these big macro stories. The Exodus, when did you feel in bondage? Exile, when was that? And how about your return? Second Isaiah, of course, says it all. We've heard that. There is a way of return. And it's going to be smooth. Isaiah 40, 3 through 4. That's the main passage. This story images the religious life as a journey to the place where God is present, a homecoming. We're going to go home. And the way is going to be smooth. And God assists all who take that journey. The third story is the priestly story. And this story is grounded in an institution of ancient Israel. You'll know it very well. The temple, the priesthood, and sacrifice. The priest is the one who makes us right with God by offering sacrifice on our behalf. The image of the religious life is a story of sin, guilt, sacrifice, and forgiveness. And central notions to it are impurity, defilement, uncleanness. So it is also linked to images of being cleansed and washing and covering over. And in this story, we are sinners who have broken God's laws, and we're guilty before God and the lawgiver and the judge. And seen through this lens, the religious life becomes a story of sin, guilt, and forgiveness. So, of those three macro stories, which one has stayed with us and is more pervasive in our culture? I'll wait. It's all right. Oh, I got time. What do you think? The priestly, the Exodus, or the exile and the return? Which one is more pervasive in our culture today? What has the conventional wisdom? What are most churches out there? You know, if you're going to say, you're going to hear more about sin, guilt, forgiveness, that track, and about reward and punishment, this kind of thing. That's the one. That's the one that has really caught or grabbed hold of our own psyche, our own heart, that has somehow, for a lot of reasons, has really been pervasive. And that's the one. Not saying that it's all untrue or anything like that, but that's the one that stayed with us more than any other. So Jesus comes in and looks at these macro stories. All three of them shape the message of Jesus. Okay, all three of them do. And they shape the New Testament and even our own Christian theology. Jesus triumphs over the powers that hold humans in bondage. Okay, if people are in bondage, Jesus can come and triumph over those powers. So there's that one story. Jesus as a sacrifice for sin. Now that's been one that's been there for a long time. Not all scholars, you have to know, not all scholars park themselves in that camp, as though Jesus came to be as a sacrifice for sin, and we needed an atonement for that. Not all scholars are there. I'm not quite there myself. I don't park myself in that spot really strongly. It's one, but that's part of the tradition for sure. That's part of our tradition. Has been with us for a long time. So understanding it is pretty important. And then Jesus as a revelation or a disclosure. This comes out of the exile story, revealing something that is true, what God is like, and Jesus as the light. Hey, that's like today's service. As the light, Jesus' death and resurrection as the incarnation of the path of return from exile. We go out, and the resurrection brings us back in. So the priestly story, there's the answer. Priestly story has dominated the popular understanding of this day. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I don't mean to do that. I just forget that I have this crazy thing on. Excuse me. That priestly story shapes our sense of who we are, our image of Jesus, and what God requires. And for me, it's a skewed picture, to think of ourselves as lowly worms. I've heard sermons where they talk of us that way, that we've got to climb our way back into God's good graces. And the only way we can do that is by riding on the back of Jesus, by getting up on that cross. And that's the only way over the edge, that God will then accept us renewed people somehow. I mean, that's the story. That's the story that's in that. Let's see. It shapes who we are. The pluses of this, okay, the pluses of the priestly story are that it shows God's great love for us, like in John 3:16, and that we are accepted just as we are. Great, that's a great statement. But when the priestly story becomes dominant, the only story for imaging Jesus, it has serious limitations, severe distortions in our understanding of the Christian life. And this is what Borg says. It leads to a static understanding of the Christian life, that it's one of sin, guilt, and forgiveness, and that's it. It leads to passivity about the religious life itself. So see, you got to hear my sermon today, okay? You got to hear that. It's not about passivity. It's on hope today. It's on hope. And you can't be hopeful if you're passive. You can't be hopeful if you're passive. It's not from a weak stance. It's from a strong stance of who we are as children of God, that you can hope. That's what I'm saying. I'm not giving my sermon away, so you can still come. It leads, all right. Rather than seeing life as a process of spiritual transformation, it stresses believing that God has already done what needs to be done. Okay? Rather than seeing life as a process of spiritual transformation, it stresses belief. And we talked about that last week. Belief in God over against a relationship with God. Believing that God has already done what needs to be done. And with that, hold on. Yep, I can finish with this and go. Yay, just like that. The time is going to work out. One can see this by imagining how our vision of the Christian life would be different if our church services regularly included a description of the human condition flowing from the other two macro stories. Okay? Either instead of or alternating with the confession of sin. What if we were to say, we are Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and we beseech you for liberation? Or we live in Babylon, and we ask you for deliverance. One can understand why the church, during the many centuries that it was the official religion of the Western culture, emphasized confession of sin rather than saying that the culture we live in is Egypt or Babylon. The priestly story, hear this, the priestly story is a politically domesticating story. Does that make sense? Because what that means is politicians can control us more with that kind of story rather than the other two. Okay? If you only see yourself as a sinner, as just a lowly, I can never make it back up again, that's a politically domesticating stance to be in. The stories of bondage in Egypt and exile in Babylon are culturally subversive stories. The priestly story, this is the last sentence, a priestly story tends also to lead to an understanding of Christianity as primarily a religion of the afterlife. The crucial issue becomes being right with God before we die, believe now for the sake of salvation later. So it's that, again, the reward and punishment idea, that's what religion is really all about. When he would say it's really more about this relationship that we have now in becoming transformed here to live in peace and in trust with our God. That's where that is leading. All right. Well, I hope I haven't confused you tremendously. What I hope I've done is said, I got to read that book. I got to go get that and finish that chapter because I've left this much, that much out of that chapter. There's more to share. But nonetheless, I hope that was helpful. I love talking about this topic. So I appreciate you being attentive, as these ladies are, looking up. And I hope to come back again soon. So thanks. That's all I know to say. Questions, comments? See me after church. All right? I got to get.